Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Whether it's spring planting, fall harvesting, or just a drive across the state, soy biodiesel helps a diesel-powered engine operate in a demanding job. Soybean oil from Nebraska soybeans makes biodiesel a renewable fuel that's also environmentally responsible. The soybean checkoff plays a major role in supporting the use and availability of biodiesel. The Nebraska Soybean Board, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Mike Briggs looks at feeding margins. Roger Elmore explains recommendations for corn and soybean planting. Nathan Mueller discusses soybean inoculation, and Dave Aiken outlines a legislative bill on custom hog feeding in Nebraska. Mike Briggs is our cattle market analyst this week. The USDA's March Cattle on Feed report shows Nebraska led the nation with nearly 2.5 million cattle in feedlots of more than 1,000 head capacity. Overall, the U.S. was down about 1%, while placements were 8% below a year ago, and marketings were down 2%. In grocery stores across the country, all fresh retail beef reached another new high in February, averaging $6.03 per pound. Ground beef increased slightly from January to average $4.24 per pound. That's also a record and 68 cents more expensive than February 2014. The latest Sterling Beef Profit Tracker has feeding margins in the red at more than $171 per head. But when we talked with Mike Thursday morning, we began by looking at the recent rally in cattle markets.
Well, it's been great in my mind just because fundamentals finally started to make an impact on the market. You know, we've talked about that in previous shows, that the technicals were just taking it over and the funds were just pounding it, and it didn't make any sense to any of us, and wondering why don't fundamentals matter? Well, they finally did, and I think we're going to see that now clear into maybe the middle of June.
Meaning that the rally continues?
I think the rally grinds higher because the cattle aren't there. The cattle weren't, we talked about the cattle weren't there in March. They're not going to be any more in April. Now maybe May and June you'll see a few more calf feds come to the market, but I just don't think you're going to see that many cattle. Now on the other side of that, we obviously are making cattle bigger, so the total meat supply isn't quite as low as it would have been otherwise, but we're still going to be short cattle and short beef.
The Cattle on Feed report showed lower numbers of cattle in placements. Did you interpret that to be bullish?
It's friendly, and you're going to continue to see that because you've got an inverse in the market where the nearby is higher than the deferred, which makes it impossible, well, not impossible, it just makes it really hard to place cattle. And the market is basically telling you, we want the cattle now, we don't care about in the future. And that's what's going to happen. You're going to see feedlot placements continue to be under last year.
How much has this rally helped margins?
Considerably, because you were into where the numbers were pretty red, and in fact in some cases really red because of the bad weather in January and February. The cattle did not perform very well, and you had a big drop in the cash, and cattle were losing money. Now we're back to where we got a positive margin, so it's a lot more fun again.
Yeah, I bet it is. Next week we have some potentially moving market reports for the crops at least.
Yes.
How are you approaching that for corn? I'm
going to have myself covered. I think I'm going to be kind of flat, though I might have a little bit of length in the market, but not very much. It's never a good situation for the market when the farmer's got all the grain, and he does. They have always called that weak hands, and I'm afraid that's still the way it's going to be. Eventually the market's going to force them to bring it to town, and probably not at a price they like.
Yeah, you're bearish in the corn market then?
Overall, now they make a big deal about how we might come up short planted acres. We'll see. I don't know. Maybe you will. I hope not, because I like cheaper corn price.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. So one thing that's not cheap is the price of beef. Reached another high in February. What is the consumer doing?
consumer demand has been tremendous, and it just tells you hamburger's kind of king here. And the consumer has been willing to pay for it. And I think, unfortunately for them, I think it's going to stay high, and it's probably going to get higher because not only is slaughter down of fat cattle, but your cow slaughter is way down. And that's not going to get any more because the guys are going to, the ranchers are going to try to keep those cows so they have those calves, because the calves are very profitable right now. So they're not going to get rid of cows unless they absolutely have to, and unless Mother Nature keeps it dry, which it is a little dry, especially in western Nebraska right now. If we have another drought issue, that's really going to be serious to this cattle market. We need to turn this thing around and grow supply, not have another weather force reduction in the herd.
Tell me about slaughter weights that we're seeing, or at least that you're seeing in this feedlot. I
think they're going to remain large for several reasons. One, you've got a nice margin there between what it's costing you and what you're getting, and it's really hard to replace cattle. So the feeder fat swap is horrible. So you just as well keep what you have, make it bigger. The market's paying you to do it. So I think people are going to continue to do that until the market tells them differently, or until corn gets too high and we've squeezed that margin, one of the two. But I think slaughter weights remain high.
So what we saw last year, the consumer hanging in when the price got expensive, do you think it's a realistic expectation that they'll do the same and not go to a cheaper chicken or pork come grilling season?
I absolutely do, because one, gas is cheaper, so they've got more cash in their pocket. Two, it was high last year, and you know, I read this little smart remark the other day, so I'm just going to repeat it. What do you want to put in your bun? Ground hamburger, ground chicken, or ground pork? And hamburger's king. So we're doing good so far. I really don't see the consumer straying away, because I don't think financially, I think financially they're in a better position, so they don't need to, and that's what they like.
Next week, North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson will analyze the USDA's March 31st reports on quarterly grain stocks and prospective plantings. University of Missouri Extension economist Ron Plain will also join us to look at numbers from the agency's quarterly hogs and pigs report. On Monday, Nebraska's National Agricultural Statistics Service will rate the condition of the state's winter wheat crop. The last look we had at the beginning of March showed 62% of the state's crop in good to excellent condition, but a recent report from the Nebraska Wheat Board indicates injury and winter kill is evident in certain areas of the state. Next week, we'll travel west and discuss the damage with Nebraska Extension's Bob Klein. On Tuesday, we'll learn how many acres of each crop the USDA believes farmers intend to plant this year. The agency's prospective plantings report is scheduled for release at 11 a.m. that morning. As farmers in Nebraska continue preparing for the planting season, we recently talked with Nebraska Extension agronomist Roger Elmore to learn more about certain recommendations. We started by asking Roger how important planting dates are for corn and soybeans.
In corn, it depends on where you are, of course, in the state, but in general, we should start thinking about the third week in April, maybe the fourth week in April. There are old reports that say that for every day in May you lose a bushel, and you can find data that will tell you that, but in general, once you get into late April, you look at soil temperatures, you look at how moist that soil is, and you plant. But in both cases, soybeans and corn, you want to look at the next week or 10 days of forecast. Are they conducive for early season germination, seedling growth, and emergence? That's what you're interested in.
What does the research show for soybeans of that ideal planting window?
For the southern two-thirds of Nebraska, it's the last week in April, first week in May. But boy, you know, the worst thing you can do is look at that calendar date and mud things in, meaning that the soils are too wet. And it's far better in those situations just to wait till things dry out. And there are some years that really, the later you plant in May, the better yields are. And it all depends on the soil conditions at planting and what happens after planting.
How dangerous are the frost risks that you might encounter?
That's the issue with early or late April planting, and sometimes even early May planting. But the advantage in both crops is we've got some built-in recovery techniques. In corn, there's a growing point that's below ground until the 6th leaf stage. So in general, that saves us if you get that top frozen off. On soybeans, every bud above ground, or every leaf has got 1 or 2 buds that can reproduce a plant. So we've got a lot of built-in resilience there. My experience on frost, on hail, and soybeans side by side, the soybeans really do a little better than corn, believe it or not. But you got to get out there and evaluate it right after 3 or 4 or 5 days after the frost.
From your experience, would you recommend using a soybean seed treatment the earlier you go?
Depending on the situation, usually not. Most of the data shows that it isn't a factor for early planting, but you've got to remember that what I'm suggesting for planting date is that you have warm soils and they're getting warmer. That's the bottom line on soils. The time that seed treatments really do pay off is if you're doing a replant, where you're coming in after a frost or a hail event, or for some reason have lost your stand. Replanting soybeans without treatment into a previously planted crop is not a good deal.
Is there a range that producers should be looking at for soybean population?
Certainly. You know, in the old days we used to talk about a bushel an acre, you know, which would be 150,000 seeds per acre or so. The new research is very clear. You can plant that, it's not going to affect yield, but you can also plant 120,000 plants or seeds per acre and get the same yield. So you're saving 30 to 40,000 seeds per acre with the seeding rate of 120,000.
And the seeding depth as farmers get ready to hit the fields?
For corn and soybeans both. Soybeans 1 3/4 to 2 inches, and corn is almost identical. The important thing is to get uniformity in that seed depth, so you get uniform emergence. That's especially important in corn. We're looking for not only getting the right stand there in corn, but we're also looking for emergence timing. Ideally, every plant comes up at the same time.
We should note the insurance implications for planting very early. For corn in the southeastern half of Nebraska, the initial planting date for crop insurance is April 10th. For the northwest portion, the initial planting date is April 15th. Most counties in Nebraska carry a date of April 25th for soybean planting. Risk Management Agency maps can be found online and through a link on the Market Journal website. Nebraska's farmers last year harvested nearly 5.4 million acres of soybeans, producing almost 289 million bushels of beans. As planting approaches, Nebraska Extension Cropping Systems educator Nathan Mueller says some growers are wondering about inoculating their soybeans. We recently discussed the topic with Nathan on UNL's East Campus fields. We began by asking how much nitrogen soybeans will need during the growing season.
Soybeans is really, the answer to that is it actually needs more than corn in terms of the nitrogen. It's a high protein seed, so there's a lot of nitrogen need in soybeans. The advantage is that we have this nice symbiosis with this bacteria that helps us fix some of that nitrogen we need in our soybean crop.
A lot of people, you say, ask you if they should inoculate your soybeans, and you say, with what? Why do you say that?
Well, inoculate, it could be a lot of things. It could be bacterial Goss's wilt. You don't want to inoculate your corn with that, right? Yeah. So when you say, I'm going to inoculate my soybeans, usually talking about Bradyrhizobium japonicum. And that's the bacteria that has that symbiosis with the soybean plant that converts nitrogen in the air to plant available nitrogen. And that process gives the soybean about 50 to 70% of its nitrogen needs. And the other part comes from what's available in the soil.
What are the questions that you ask when a farmer says, should I then use that?
Yeah, so one of them is how long, maybe for example, has this field obviously has been in rotation, but if it's been out of soybean rotation for 5 years, that's starting to get where I'm gonna say, yeah, maybe lean towards putting the inoculant on. It's not real expensive. Another one is low pH. So as you get below 6, 5.8, the bacteria don't like that environment, so their populations go down. Another one is sandy soils. And another one is flooding. So when we had the floods of 2011, for example, and you had a week or more or months of flooding, that's going to kill those bacteria, those beneficial bacteria off.
So you're talking about in a replant situation, then you should?
Yes. And so if we had floods for a week, for example, this past year, there'd be a good way to putting inoculant on when you've had extended flooding. So whenever answer to one of those 4 questions is yes, I say go ahead and put the inoculant on. If you answered no to all those, if you've been in a corn soybean rotation, a well-drained soil, you've managed your pH well, you're on medium textured soils, there's a really good study that was done from 2000 to 2008 across 4 states, including Nebraska, that eventually saw that the yield increase was 0 bushels or 0%. And so there's not a lot of data to support the need for that extra cost, especially looking at cost this year, to adding that if you don't need it.
Is there any reason behind that data? Have you been able to correlate why that's the case?
Really just because the native populations of the Brady Rhizobium japonicum are high enough that they're there to inoculate the soybean roots and start that symbiotic relationship. So that's the advantage to have soybean rotation. So even if you're in corn-soybean rotation, again, that's less than that 3 to 5 years and really not a concern. One that comes up is maybe after alfalfa, right? I've planted alfalfa for 5 years and then I plant corn after alfalfa. So now you're all of a sudden at that 5, 6 years out. The thing is, you're also getting some nitrogen credit from your alfalfa crop even the second year after. But again, that's a situation where look at the cost of the inoculant, and it's one of those borderline questions where I would lean towards applying it.
In a few weeks, Nathan will join us again to talk about the importance of knowing specifics when using precision ag tools. The March Nebraska farmer says Nebraska soybean oil is helping consumers in New York City warm their homes. This month's issue details how the Nebraska Soybean Board has been a leader in promoting bioheat use there. Bioheat is traditional home heating oil blended with biodiesel, which includes soybean oil. New York City officials told Nebraska soybean producers that bioheat lowers their costs and is friendlier to the environment than straight home heating oil. You can read about this market opportunity for soybeans in the March Nebraska Farmer. Nebraska Extension and the Nebraska Corn Board are teaming up again to offer 4-Hers and FFA members the chance to win cash through the 2015 Innovative Youth Corn Challenge. Through the contest, teams will use a production practice in corn attempting to increase yield. While cash prizes will be handed out to first, second, and third places, awards will also be given to teams who excel in crop scouting and sustainability. Nebraska Extension educator Brandy Vandewaal explains the purpose of this challenge.
First of all, they have a chance to work with a mentor. So whether it's a crop consultant, another extension faculty member, or their FFA advisor, it gives them a chance to, get that experiential learning and get engaged with the crops and go through, a project. They're out there in the field, so they're learning how to scout for insects, diseases, and hopefully give them a flavor for what it is like to work in an agronomy area. And ultimately, we would like them to pursue a career in agronomy or at least in agriculture so we can keep them and bring them back to their rural communities.
The first place team will receive $1,000, second place will be awarded $500, and third place will receive $250. To participate, you need to submit a short entry form by April 1st. You can find that form on the Market Journal website. In our previous episode of Market Journal, we discussed how 3 bills before the Nebraska legislature could aid livestock expansion in this state. One measure, LB 176, could increase pork production. As we've said, Nebraska ranks 7th in the nation in commercial hog slaughter. While it has increased production, a 2013 report from UNL's Department of Ag Economics showed it hadn't scaled up as quickly as its neighbors. From 2003 to 2012, Iowa increased its inventory of market hogs by nearly 32%. Indiana added 26%, Minnesota 20%, Kansas 17%, and Illinois 15%. Nebraska only grew by 3%. Because the livestock and crop industries are enormously connected in this state, that slow pace can also affect corn and soybean producers. The same UNL report showed nearly 80% of Nebraska's soybean meal was being moved out of state for use. While LB 176 could help increase Nebraska's role in the U.S. pork industry, Nebraska Extension Ag Law Specialist Dave Aiken says other states with similar measures have added extra provisions to further protect producers.
Well, LB 176 would authorize custom feeding between meat packers and Nebraska livestock producers. For a long time in Nebraska, that had been outlawed by Initiative 300, the corporate farming law, and also it's also been outlined by statute, so that existing statute would be modified by LB 176 to authorize this for the first time in a long time.
Tell me how the contracts would be regulated.
Well, there is federal law, the so-called GIPSA rule that USDA implements, which has some basic kind of fairness requirements for these, but I don't think they go as far as they need to protect producers and these types of things, because the producers, the packers are big, have all the lawyers, give them a 50-page contract that I couldn't understand, and say sign it or take it or leave it, and that's it. At least that's been the experience of the poultry industry. And so dealing with those kinds of abuses are kind of what these concerns are about here.
So you say these GIPSA rules, they deal primarily with three things. The first is contract cancellation, the second is capital investment disclosure, and the third is dispute resolution. Let's talk about those individually and if they go far enough. The first is contract cancellation provisions. Tell me about that.
Well, the GIPSA rules give producers 3 days to walk away from the deal after they've signed it, and that's a good first step. But most of these contracts have confidentiality requirements that say that you can't tell anybody what's in this because this is all a trade secret. So they can't take it to the lawyer and say, you know, is this good or bad for me? They can't take it to their accountant, say, is this going to work for me financially? And so a lot of states have gone beyond this and said, no, you have to be able to show this to your business partners, your family, and your advisors.
Okay, let's talk about the second one, capital investment disclosures.
Well, this again, the GIPSA rules require that if the producer is going to have to make a capital investment of $12,500 or more, that has to be disclosed up front and prominently, so that when the producer signs it, and originally when they sign it, they didn't get a chance to review it, they would then realize that they were going to have to find the money to build whatever it was they're going to have to build to be able to implement the contract.
So did that offer enough protection for producers?
Well, again, some states don't think so because producers, the issue is that if the contract is canceled, say halfway in, and you still got this big loan on this farrowing house or this swine facility that you haven't paid for yet, you know, you could be in a pretty bad way.
All right, the third angle of this is the dispute resolution. Tell me about that.
Well, a lot of these things are set up with arbitration clauses saying that if we have any disagreements about what this contract means, we will settle it through binding arbitration, and the packer gets to appoint who the arbitrator is. A lot of times it may even be employees. And you know, this is pretty one-sided. And so what some states have done is said, no, if you're going to do this, either let them go to court or take it to mediation, where the mediator is not a lawyer, no lawyers involved in the process at all, and they try to come up with a win-win rather than just, you know, which technicality wins.
So states have gone beyond these GIPSA rules then?
That's right. Several states have. They started in the southeast, but there are several states in the Corn Belt that have as well. And those states include like Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Arkansas, and Georgia.
Tell me what some of those common producer protection clauses include.
Well, they have requirements that the contract be understandable, that it be written in basically junior high school level complexity, and that all the financial risks to the producer are clearly disclosed up front. Give the producers the first lien ahead of the packers' creditors in terms of payment, so that if there's not enough money, the producer gets paid first, and then prohibiting retaliation if producers do things to try to, you know, enhance their own economic standing or you know, join with other producers and associations, something like that.
So you mentioned that these other states have already done it. If Nebraska were to pass 176, what would be the route that Nebraska would go to also ensure these protections?
Well, if 176 were passed today, the GIPSA protections would be there, but as we've discussed, I don't think they go far enough. We would need to either amend 176 or pass a separate new LB to, you know, get some of these things added into and make it part of Nebraska law as well.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension State climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. During this past week, of course, we dealt with several precipitation events. The major one was on Monday, as we've seen that system push out of the southwestern United States and bring a trough across the center part of the country. And most of the heavy precipitation fell in eastern Nebraska. In fact, the eastern one quarter of the state seen precipitation totals varying on average between 0.4 of an inch and 0.75 of an inch, with a few isolated spots that approached the 1 inch mark. But as you headed towards central Nebraska, precipitation totals dropped off rather dramatically, and we were only looking at anywhere from trace amounts to less than 1/10 of an inch from central Nebraska westward. And then the preceding fronts that moved through on a daily basis really didn't give us a lot of significant moisture outside of the Thursday event, which did drop some light precipitation, less than 1/4 inch in most places from north central through southeast Nebraska. We had another wave move through last night, but it didn't really produce much, and we are expecting a fairly nice forecast here for the next few days before we start to turn our attention to the potential for precipitation as we move through the middle into the end of next week. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we can expect. Our first system that's coming down the pipeline is now over the Dakotas, expected to rapidly shoot toward the southern Great Lakes region, and that'll drag a cold front across the northern plains and may impact portions of northeast Nebraska with some light precipitation during the overnight hours, and there might even be a few snowflakes thrown in with that. Less of a chance across to east central and southeast Nebraska, and as you're in western Nebraska, it doesn't look like any precipitation out of this system. And so by the time we get to tomorrow, that system will pass the Great Lakes, and now we'll start to see ridging trying to build into our region. So we're going to see a fairly nice end of the weekend in terms of temperatures. We'll be looking consistently to be into the 70-degree range, and that will expand toward eastern Nebraska, particularly as we get into Monday and Tuesday. As that ridge starts to push eastward, we'll see temperatures in the mid-70s out west to possibly even upper 70s in a few isolated locations, low 70s across eastern Nebraska. As we get into Tuesday, we'll hold those conditions again for the temperatures. That ridge, the center of the ridge is right over top of us. But we have a trough that's going to be moving across the northern plains that will kind of push this ridge down slightly as we go into the midweek period. And here we are on Wednesday as that trough tries to push down. There is some signs of the model trying to generate some precipitation scattered across northern Nebraska, but right now it doesn't look like a real good moisture source. More importantly, we start to see the trough developing on Thursday that looks to be more significant, and we'll start to see energy coming into western Nebraska Thursday evening. And by the time we get into Friday, we'll see that that system has wound itself up over eastern Kansas, and therefore we might see some significant precipitation across eastern Nebraska and possibly even accumulating snowfall across western Nebraska. Keep an eye on the weather that may change as we go forward in time. In terms of the temperature forecast, we are looking at real nice conditions this weekend, and then a slight cool down as we go into next week, late next week, with a chance of precipitation starting to increase rather dramatically on Friday. In terms of the 8 to 14-day forecast, we keep the cool conditions in place, and in terms of precipitation, a wetter trend for the first time in several weeks.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on cattle markets, corn and soybean planting recommendations, soybean inoculation, and custom hog feeding. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Next week, Frayne Olson will analyze corn and soybean markets, Ron Plain will look at hog inventory numbers, and Bob Klein will talk about the rough shape of Nebraska's winter wheat crop. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board and the Nebraska Soybean Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.